So, thank you for coming and seeing this talk before lunch. I know you're probably looking forward to the gorgeous food that's outside. I know personally I find NDC a bit of a food festival as well as a tech conference, so I hope you're excited about it as I am. I'm Jess, I work for Experian, and today I'm going to be talking about controlling wildfires while only getting singed. Now, what do I mean by this title? I've worked with a few systems now, and I tried to think about how I would describe them on Gumtree, because a lot of places don't like using the word legacy or anything like that. It brings a lot of different meaning to it. So I decided to go with the pre-loved vintage system with a lot of its own personality. It certainly has a few quirks, most of the systems I've worked with. And realistically, at some point, someone has loved this system. They might have had to deal with time constraints or pressures from other teams or product. You don't know how it's got into the state it's currently in. All you know is it's not quite, oh, I'm okay. Oh, sorry. Got too much hair, apparently. All you know is that it's not quite up to what you would expect or what you like to work with. But with a bit of patching up, we can probably get it there. Well, where do you start? Especially with a lot of these pre-loved systems, it might be quite overwhelming to deal with the challenge. So this is going to be a very high-level talk. I'm going to talk through the battle plan of when you've been maybe handed one of these systems and how you have to deal with it. We'll go through getting an overview of the system, prioritizing the work, the measurements that can help, the importance of communication, and being ready for failure. Each of these sections could probably be an entire talk in itself, so it will be a high-level overview. But if you do have any questions, I am about, and I can hardly call myself intimidating, as much as I try to be in my leather jacket. The most important part, I think, and it is definitely always a starting point, is language. Being at NDC London, I can assume that most of us are native English speakers or have quite a strong English capability. So we all think we speak the same language here. We really don't. We could be saying the same words, but not understanding each other at all. And when it comes to taking on these systems, you might find that the people who take ownership of your product and your domain, your stakeholders, and even the developers who worked on it previously are all saying the same words, but they're all meaning entirely different things. So, quick analogy. Can anybody tell me what these are? Pants. Now, go to America, and it's an entirely different meaning. And this has led to many hilarious scenes on many a sitcom where no pants, no service. It's funny, but when it comes to your actual system, it can be unbelievably dangerous, it can lead to arguments, it can actually lead into huge disagreements between teams, and that's hard to recover from. So start on the same page. Get that agreed language. If you need to document it, that's fine. Glossaries have been around for ages, and that's what they're for. Make sure that the people who you're going to be interacting with on a regular basis, be that your clients, your stakeholders, or otherwise, make sure that they're seeing these communications and agreeing with you on them. It's not a dictatorship, it's agreement. So, we're all speaking the same language, luckily. Let's start with understanding the domain. This can be interesting. And again, I like my analogies and I like my doodles, so if you haven't been to one of my talks before, get ready for a lot of really bad drawings. I like to think about understanding domains a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. A lot of people like to start with the actual components of a system, services, the APIs, and work their way up. But by doing this, it's a bit like starting with the jigsaw puzzle pieces, without the box lid. You think you've got all the pieces to make the full picture. You don't necessarily know how these things are going to fit together. It'll take quite a bit of time to get these things and get that full picture. It might be you're missing pieces and you wouldn't even know. Or possibly you've got a couple of jigsaw puzzles mixed up and that becomes complex again. It's a lot easier when you've got your jigsaw puzzle lid, you've got your full picture, and you know what's going on. It's the same when you're trying to understand a domain. Similar to Ian's talk that I've just been in, you need to know exactly what your system is doing before you go about splitting it apart, for example. And that's why I'd probably start with users and stakeholders. This could be your product managers and owners. It could be your clients. It could be the users themselves, depending on what you're working with. There's a few different strategies for this. With people who are either external teams using your APIs, maybe a client, I'd probably start with the documentation. Not providing them with it, but what do they use when they're trying to teach somebody about using your system, or when they're trying to figure out that they want to do something and if that feature is available. By the way, if it's not clear, I work a lot with backend, so a lot of my examples will be based around APIs and services. But work with their documentation and talk them through the features they use. This also gets around the problem of bugs turning into features, because trust me, you don't want to fix a bug and then find out that you've got a whole call center using that functionality. They get angry pretty quick. And then your product owners and your product managers, hopefully they've been working with the system for a while. It's quite fun to just get them into a room with a whiteboard and say, give me the simplest journey through the system for a customer, for a client. What is it that you would expect? And if they're a more technical product person, maybe even mapping which components of your system they think appropriate to which bit. Gives you an idea of some map. At this point, you have your jigsaw puzzle box. You have that full picture that you know that you're working to. And most importantly, you know which bits that you really don't want to break. This also gives you your key performance indicators. I've got quite a thing for metrics and monitoring. But key performance indicators are important no matter what. This is how your system is supposed to behave. And it's a language that your business can understand. So if you're meeting these points, business is happy to. Then we get down to actually the jigsaw pieces, assessing these components. There's a lot of different parts to this, and it can take a little while. But have a look through READMEs, high-level documentation, run the tests to see if they pass, and then give those tests a quick glance over to see if there's any assert trues equals trues. We've all seen it, and probably some of us have done it by accident. But making sure that those tests are actually useful. Maybe give a quick scan of the code. Does it meet the standardization that you're kind of used to for the company? Does it meet the same sort of practices as you would expect from other teams? Could somebody come in and know what they're doing? And mapping out the different components, the services, the APIs, the databases, front end, etc. And trying to build that back into that conversation that you've had with your stakeholders, your users, and your clients. We've now got a pretty decent idea of our domain at this point. Big curveball. While we're doing all this, we're always going to have to deal with reactive work, because there is no way this lovely pre-loved system is not breaking left, right, and center, from my experience anyway. This quote is from the homepage of the Google SRE site by Tanya Riley, and I think it points out something very important when it comes to reactive issues, more on a cultural level than a technical level. For those at the back, because I know it's not a great contrast, but here's what you do when someone breaks something or finds something very difficult to debug. You say thank you. Thank you for finding this edge case. Thank you for highlighting this overcomplicated part of our system. Thank you for pointing out this gap in our docs, and then go make it so no one can break it the same way again. I know it's a strange thing to say, but I actually really like reactive work. It's a great way of learning those little behavioral quirks of your pre-loved system and finding out actually how it works underneath. It's also a really good way of getting to know other teams. The teams who are going to spot these things are the people who are using your system, or having that 3 o'clock in the morning phone call, and we want them on the right side as well. So engage those working on live issues. I originally called this Love Your On-Call Teams, because we have a kind of on-call system at work which works very effectively. But if you work with these people to figure out, next person who comes across this problem, can we make sure this never happens again? If it does, will they be told quickly, and will they know what to do? And by that point, the more you work on this stuff, the more it will evolve, and the less you'll have to work on live issues throughout that time. The great thing is it also has a really easy, visible business impact without you having to put in extra logs, extra metrics, extra work. By being able to say, this is how many times this breaks. This is how long it takes to solve this issue by this engineer that costs this much money, because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, unfortunately. This is the customer impact that this has. No one can argue with that kind of stat. And that's how you kind of get the buy-in to keep fixing these things overall. But you're showing that while you're learning this lovely little system, that you're also having an effective impact. And as I briefly mentioned, increasing the team's depth of knowledge. If you do have on-call at your business and you are not part of it, I urge you, please, please do take part in on-call or anything that involves reacting to live issues. It gives you a great idea of your company's domain. It really teaches you about debugging, which is not only useful, but really fun. I'm going to try and sell this to you best I can. But it's so valuable. And having the ideas of the intricacies of the systems you're working with avoids future mistakes. So we've got our domain. We're having these curveballs or grenades of reactive work thrown at us. It's already sounding a bit intense. Oh, sorry, living documentation. I should bring this up first because it comes into both sides. But living documentation is also important for reactive work. Because the first place that people are going to go to is to your documentation, and it comes in many forms. The problem with this I've found so far is making it a cultural thing. So adapt to what your team's used to. Your documentation can be with tests with Postman, for example, if that's more likely to be updated as you update your system. I like to use READMEs as a source of truth, so I have links to runbooks, links to high-level documentation, maybe links to Swagger docs in my README because it's right next to the code, and I know that if anybody's going to be working on a system, it's right there where they need it. Swagger is another example. If you think your team's going to be better with that kind of system, make it easy for your team to think of documentation the same time as they're thinking, what feature work do I need to do? How is this test covered? Documentation should be a first-class citizen with everything else. It will make life easier in the long run. Unfortunately, with these systems, the documentation that exists, if it exists, might be a bit out of date. So making sure that it's visible, that either it's out of date or that you need to update it is also very, very useful for everyone. And having this as measurable work. So as I say, it's easiest if you can get it to work with the culture of your team. If this is becoming a bit of a struggle, you can even put in stories. Like if you're working in a Scrum or Kanban way, going, right, we've got to do this piece of work. What's the documentation that we need to hit in order to make sure that this is covered and people can work with our systems better? And it's all about reacting and evolving to these issues. Throughout each of these issues, you want to say thank you because it's getting you to a safer place and it's going to get you to a state where you're not having to react so much. Which makes more time for proactive work. This can be in a couple of different forms. So most planned work we think of is normally product feature work. You can also have proactive technical work in this case. As you've gone through and learnt your domain, you will have found things that you desperately want to fix. I've been working on a system for 10 months now, and I still have a little list at the back of my head, which occasionally keeps me up at night because I know how to fix it, but never find the time. Proactive work is always going to be hitting at the same time. Nobody's going to give you a break, unfortunately, to learn this domain, to fix the world, and get to a state where you want to be in. So how do we deal with this? I'm not going to say the word. But there's a special little list which came up, which will come up very early in this whole process. A lot of this stuff, as I've mentioned, all hits at the same time. But this special little list will be the list of the things that you know need fixing. And it will be in a case of priority depending on maybe security, deadlines within the business, or even deadlines with the tools itself. We've had to recently go through a Python upgrade, for instance, because that went out of support in January. Stability, making sure that the system's stable and you're not having to deal with all these reactive issues. Architectural cost. I find this one quite fun, but it might be that the system that you're currently working with could be built in a cheaper way. And also, cheaper is better for the business, it makes them very happy. Alignment to product need. Had a very lucky situation personally myself, which I never thought would have come up, where I had a technical need of wanting to put in some logging and alerting. Somehow, this also turned up on the product backlog. They wanted to know when things are broken. Both teams are happy, and we get to prioritize that quite high. Standardisation, so again, trying to make sure that people can walk into your team and work with what's there. And upcoming technical requirements, which are normally across the board. Now, while creating this list, the most recent way we've gone about it is getting the people who are technical leads, the team itself who's dealing with the code. Sometimes it's fun to get a product manager in there as well. Get them into one room with a lot of Post-its and go, write down the first things that come into your head that you can think of that we need to fix. All these Post-its go up on a wall, and then we prioritize depending on this list. And what's the business concerns at the time? Maybe they have a big security push, for example. Or maybe it aligns to a product want. And once we've got that list sorted, keep it visible, keep it safe. With this particular list, the most recent one, we actually had it on a big sticky piece of paper, unfortunately with the fully titled poop list at the top, and actually just stuck it on a wall. This eventually went into Jira stories and Jira epics, but the reason why we kept it so visible is because you will always have people going, but why can't you just do this little thing? It's only a tiny job. And there's something quite enjoyable of going, that's why. It's giving the visibility that you have a lot to deal with as a team when you're taking over this system, and that you are considering prioritization. Also, it will help with prioritization of that proactive feature work, because you'll be working to the same sort of language, and I'll come back to that. Prioritizing when everything is urgent is an absolute nightmare. And unfortunately, everybody's problem is urgent. It kind of feels like this. You've got your technical concerns that you have. You may have an architect who's wanting something. You've got product. You might have SecOps. You might have DevOps. Any department you can think of probably has something that they want you to do. Sorry, just checking the time. And it can be very overwhelming, especially if you're kind of leading this kind of team. This was the hardest lesson I have learnt dealing with these systems. Just let things burn. You can't fix everything. And it turns out, if something's really important and you just let it sit there, a lot more people realize it's important as soon as it starts breaking. This isn't saying don't do your job. It's just saying remember that you've only got a certain amount of capacity, and we understand that you can't do it all. At the end of the day, if you let something burn and let something kind of go to waste and nobody has said anything, it's probably not that important. But this brings us to transparency. Tess talked a lot about transparency in terms of ethics in her keynote this morning. And transparency, I think, is important throughout the whole of technology. But similar to having that list visible, because you want people to know what you're dealing with. Being able to go, we have prioritized these pieces of work. We have this reactive work going on. We are taking on this proactive work to ensure these things aren't fixed anymore. But we can't take in X, Y, Z for these reasons. Gives people the opportunity to have those discussions with you. Maybe you have the priority wrong. That does happen. But most importantly, people aren't horrible. They know what you're going through, and having a little bit of empathy will take you far. It will help you not burn out quite so quickly. And this is what I meant by talking the same language. By having your technical work alongside the product work, in these epics, in these stories, you can talk in the same kind of language. At the end of the day, we all work for businesses, and cost and benefit is important. So while you're trying to address these technical epics, think about and document if this is going to make running the system cheaper. Is it going to make it more stable? What's the cost of not doing this? And I don't necessarily mean financial cost, but what's the impact to your customers? If you keep bringing it back to your customers, that's something we can all understand, and that really helps with the priority. If it's a case of we want this shiny new button versus 50% of our customers can't log in, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's not something I found in the places I've worked, which is a taught skill. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a hell of a lot of writing around this area. But I think it's a really key skill. And there's always people in your companies who do this on a very regular basis. Go talk to them, find out how they're doing it, and then apply it to the technical need as well. So we have some of our system burning, got reactive issues kicking off. We've got these proactive pieces of work we're doing to make sure that everything's running and product's happy too. I know it's sounding like a lot. This is why I dye my hair different colors. It's to cover the gray. But you've also got to deploy during all this. Is there any Jurassic Park fans here? I apologize for the next slide. I can't draw, and I only draw in black and white. But there is that moment where you just got to hold onto your butts. You know that there's no tests. You don't really entirely know what your service is doing. You have a high-level view thanks to your jigsaw puzzle. But if we're honest, it might be doing a few extra things on the side. And you just got to kind of press deploy and pray. I've got a new tester recently in our team who hadn't worked with quite an interesting system before. And back when we had to do this, and the Samuel L. Jackson gif came up on our Slack quite a lot, oh, she was nervous. But so was I, because it's not a fun thing to do. I mean, how the hell do you know it's working? It's terrifying. And in this day and age, you wouldn't think it was a thing anymore. Which brings me on to some of my favorite topics. If anyone has been to any of my talks, they know that this was coming up because I talk about it all the time. Monitoring. Now with monitoring, I'm going to bring it back to language again. There are so many different forms of monitoring. So again, make sure you're talking about the same thing. Reporting comes up a lot with this kind of thing. I don't have a bugbear, I really don't. But make sure that you're talking about your logs, your metrics, your diagnostics, your alerting, and not necessarily the other bits on this slide. There are some things that you can monitor from the off which will help you deal with this system. Those key performance indicators again. Partly because you're linking it back to the business, and partly because it's really easy to tell if your system is working the way it's expected through some nice metrics. This might be, we expect a certain amount of customers to be able to go through the process. It might be response times for a public API you have. There's a number of different key performance indicators which will show that you're meeting the business need. But again, talk to your product. They'll help you out with trying to find out what you need to measure. And these will be very lightweight metrics. Systems monitoring. How do you know that your systems are up and running the way you expect? Again, there are a number of pieces of documentation around the basic level of systems monitoring you can get in for this to be useful. I actually do have an entire talk on this to plug my own stuff, but Brendan Gregg's USE, Tom Wilkie's RED, these are metrics you can put in to just know that if your service, your API is healthy, but also if it's not, where to look when it's gone wrong. If you want to look more into depth than that, I'm happy to talk about it. I live in this world and I love it. But what's really nice is with tooling these days, you can even make templates for these metrics. So it can be a case of you write it once, as long as you can plug in your service name, you can deploy it across all of them and have it in place relatively quickly. And SLIs, SLOs, and SLAs. These are talked about a lot in the Google SRE books. And for very good reason. If you go to the Google SRE workbook, it actually has examples of implementation and how you bring this into a company. I'll quickly go through what they mean. So service level objectives. It's kind of like the KPI for your services. How do you know that it's working the way that you want? Is it giving the right sort of response times, etc.? Service level objectives tends to be reached last at all of these, so I'll come back to them. Service level agreements, I imagine a few people are already familiar with. But this is the agreements you have with your other teams, with your clients, and otherwise can normally have financial impacts if you break them. So you want to know what contractual SLAs you have from the off, so you can measure them and make sure that there's not going to be a financial hit or a reputational hit. Service level indicators are those metrics you're putting in to make sure that you can check your service level objectives and service level agreements. Again, a lot of these are mentioned in those books with suggestions for these levels. Now, the service level objectives is quite interesting because you're relying on your SLIs and SLAs to know if you've met them. But they kind of evolve over time. You might want to address them once every month at the beginning to make sure they're not too loose or too tight. And by what I mean is that you're not trying to set a ceiling level. We're going to be 99.999% available from next week, because you're only going to disappoint people, unfortunately. But that is it's realistic to what you're dealing with right now. Unfortunately, you might be in a state where there's no metrics there, so this might be quite difficult to achieve from the off, which is why you want to get the first two in first. We've gone through monitoring. And here's for the contentious part. We all have an opinion, and if we say we don't have an opinion, we're probably telling fibs. But testing, you might be lucky, there might be testing there. Do check the quality of those tests, especially once you've gone through your domain mapping, because it might not be that they're testing exactly what you need. But the thing I would say with testing on these kind of systems is start from the top. Now, what do I mean by this? And this is where I get a little bit nervous talking about testing. But I personally think that your end-to-end tests and your integration tests are the most valuable tests you can have while working on these kind of systems. There's a reason. By looking at these kind of tests and seeing that they're passing, you know that you're meeting the needs of that domain, of that service. This is great because you've already got a clue about this from your previous conversations. But it also means that if you have to refactor, if you have to rewrite, there are tests in place to make sure that you aren't regressing, that you aren't breaking anything. Your tests also work as your living documentation. So that's kind of that problem dealt with at the same time. By doing your integration tests and your domain tests, it's helping your team understand your system better and how it works. I cannot emphasize enough the power of having these kind of tests in place. Whatever tooling is suitable for you, start from the top. Before we go into the writing of the actual tests, you want to check if your current tests are automated or manual. If they're manual and they're documented, that means they're doing the same thing every time. Please love your tester and automate them. Nobody likes sitting there reading through documentation and just clicking the buttons. If we can automate tests, automate them. It will make your delivery faster. It will make those who have to do these manual tests a lot happier. Do the tests match the expected behavior? You've had the conversations, you know what your system's supposed to be doing. Are those situations covered by your tests? Do they match the code? This one can be quite interesting. The other reason why I like having end-to-end integration tests first is because you're not testing what your code is doing. Because as much as I have respect for the people who've written these pre-loved domains, sometimes the decision-making is kind of funky. So making sure that your tests are covering the right things and that they actually match what's going on under the hood, making sure that it's not an assert true equals true in disguise. Are they maintainable? And this is why I really emphasize the starting from the top as well. If you've got 200 odd unit tests around one class that are all written individually, and you're going to have to change each and every one of those anytime you make a refactor, it's going to grate you. It's going to really grate you. Whereas if you have a more high-level test that you have to change, it's a lot easier to deal with. So are they maintainable for your team? And what's the lightest, most effective touch? How can you get these into a place where they're useful to you? If you want a little bit more information on this, I am going to plug Morten Broccoli, who's sitting over there, is doing a talk on Friday, which goes into this in a lot more depth. He is my partner, but I haven't actually seen the full content of his talk, and I'm really looking forward to it, because he knows what he's talking about. But going through, trying to see if these tests cover what they need to cover. So what about the unit tests? And this is a debate I've had on more than one occasion, which is why I know that testing is a contentious subject. By no means am I saying don't unit test. Please do test drive your systems. Please, when you're adding extra features, put tests around that as well. If you find a bit of funky code that you're not really sure how it works or what it's doing, try and find out with tests. The problem being is that if you're trying to cover all the code that's there, it's a jigsaw puzzle again. We don't know which bits of that code is actually useful. It's going to take a lot of time. And you want to work off the information that you know is correct. Also, you'll be testing the code and not what it's doing. I enjoy test-driven development. I find it very valuable. And if you're testing what you think your code is doing, are you really testing the behavior? When it comes to doing that refactor, that rewrite, and it will come to that, because you've got those tests in place to check your functionality, you can then write your new shiny code, put unit tests where it's needed. I'm not going to tell you how to unit test. It's entirely up to you. But they will be there eventually. It's just not the priority from the start. Now, this is, as I say, quite a very fast and overview of dealing with this kind of domain. But there's two main points that I really want to hit with this. Oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Can you tell this is the first time I've done this talk? All of these things will happen at once. Getting an overview, you want to try and do early, obviously. Prioritization, that reactive, proactive work. There's a really nice curve that will happen with this if you kind of follow these guidelines, which is that reactive work that is really overwhelming at the start should get smaller and smaller and smaller as you work with the system more, because you're reacting, you're evolving, you're making your systems easier to work with. And because of that, it means you can do a bit more proactive work, making the system better, making the new shiny features. If you can measure this throughout, really nice work, because it shows the business you're heading in the direction they want. Measurements are ever so important, partly because of transparency. Whether it's through your monitoring or your testing, whether it's just putting measurements in your epics for your technical work, showing this is the impact we're having on a customer. This is a financial impact that we're facing if we don't deal with this issue. Measurements will help you, and it will help you speak the same language throughout all your communications with the business. And as I say, communication. This comes throughout the whole of this, because unless people know what you're dealing with, they can't help you. And they certainly can't empathize. But the one point in here I don't have a slide for is being ready for failure. This is a fun challenge. It's really great to work with these systems. You get to have an easy impact on your business. You get to work with really challenging code problems. It's probably why I've done it for most of my dev career. Unfortunately, you won't get it right from the off. Alongside working with these systems and learning them, you're also probably growing a new team. They're learning the system as well. You're starting off with these new communications and relationships throughout the business. There are things that are going to slide through the cracks and go wrong. But that's fine as long as you've got that communication and transparency. And don't take it personally. I know I can say it, and saying it's a lot easier. But while these things are burning so that you can show that they need to get fixed, while you're having the conversations to explain why you can't do that bit of product work because these things need fixing, it is not on you. You have teams supporting you, and a lot of people have already been there. But be ready to get it wrong. And as I say, all of this happens in parallel. And the reason why I keep emphasizing that is because I really want to emphasize you should take care of yourself. As much as these are all points in which that you'll need to deal with, keep checking in with yourself if you are leading this kind of work. Because it's a lot. It's a hell of a lot. But nobody's trying to push you to do what you can't physically do, as long as you're honest about what's going on. And you really cannot fix the world. Trust me, I've tried. It's led to me being asleep for an entire weekend, eating a lot of ice cream, and it's not very fun. As much as we want to fix the entire world, there's that lovely little phrase that got told very early in my career: in all codes, legacy as soon as you write it. Somewhere out there will see your new shiny code and go, I want to make that better. And probably in a week's time, you'll look at your new shiny code and go, I know a better way of doing that. You can't fix the world because it's constantly broken. But you can make it a hell of a lot better, and you can make people understand it and show the efforts you're making to make the world a better place. I hope this has worked for my Miss America audition. It's not about world peace, it's about good code. Resources, as I say, high-level whirlwind, but there is a hell of a lot of resources out there, and the biggest resource, which I am going to plug right now, is right in this room. It's all the people next to you. All of you work on completely different systems, in completely different roles, and I want to know about all the worst bits you've had to deal with so I don't have to go through the pain you have. It's what keeps me sane. And please, do talk to each other in the hallway track. Talk to the speakers as well. We are the same as you, it's just that we decided to make the silly, silly mistake of entering a talk into a conference. If you saw me just before this talk, you'll understand what I mean by silly, silly mistake. I thought I was going to be vomiting behind that screen halfway through this. It's scary, but it's good. So please, talk to each other, come talk to me. I want to hear all about your systems, and I would love to tell you about some of the challenges that I can't be filmed talking about. There are books, many books. The Site Reliability Engineering Google books are great. The workbook I particularly like because it's very application-based. Talks at NDC London. There are many, many amazing talks, one of which I've already plugged. And I think you'll probably find a lot of this talk ties into what Ian was talking about earlier as well. We all kind of link into each other in our own way. And just to throw a little bit left wing, DevOps for Dummies is a really good book if you want to know about the culture of this problem. I know it's not titled in a way that might suggest it, but if you want to know about creating teams and creating the right culture to get continuous improvement in place, I cannot recommend that book highly enough. Has anyone got tickets to PubConf? More of you should. For those who don't know, PubConf is after NDC. It's not affiliated with NDC, but it's a lot of fun. You've got some speakers talking on some unfilmable subjects that they think are hilarious. The theme for this one is games. I will be speaking on a Witcher talk, which I will be writing very speedily tomorrow. It's 5-minute Ignite talks, slides auto-increment. You'll get to see us make fools out of ourselves. It's a lot of fun. So please, buy your tickets to PubConf, it's excellent. I'm also using this opportunity to plug a conference I'm running. So I run with Morton, DDD East Midlands. It's free to attend. We have 3 tracks of course, 3 tracks of talks, 60 minutes, 30 minutes, and 15 minutes. So come talk to me about that as well. And hopefully I've gone through this fast enough that we have time for questions. So if anyone does have any questions, that would be great. Ooh, none? Okay, well, I have gone through this very quickly. I apologize. It gives you time for some lunch, though. If you do want to come and chat, I am here. Please do ask as many questions as you can. I'm also on Twitter. DMs are open, so if you feel a bit shy about coming to chat, come ask some questions on there. And thank you very much for coming along. I hope you have fun with your crazy systems.